I want to bring in NBC's Dasha Burns. Former Florida Republican Congressman Carlos Curbelo is an MSNBC political analyst. And Julie Roginski joins me in studio. She's a Democratic strategist and co-founder of Lift Our Voices. Great to have all of you here. So, Dasha, why do we think the Trump campaign may be losing ground on these issues? And is there any indication they're even thinking about changing messaging?
Well, Chris, there are a lot of factors here. I mean, there is just a lot of momentum for Harris right now. Everyone was wondering whether that was going to slow down, and it hasn't really yet when you're on the ground and talking to voters. And number two, there's the real economic indicators, like what we saw with the Fed, right? Like there are things that people are starting to tangibly see turn around in the economy. And it really is that galvanizing of the base that Harris has done that I think has made some of the biggest difference here. Like the base was not excited, and now they are. And that turnout, getting people to the polls that do support you, that are in line with your issues, that's so critical. Now, for the former president, his base is still, very much on board. There are some parts of it, like the evangelical vote, that is a little bit concerned about what he's been saying on the issue of reproductive rights, for example. But one of the challenges is that his campaign has tried to consistently put him in these scenarios where he can talk about the issues, right? Whether it's at the border or at a police station trying to talk about crime, or in front of groceries talking about the economy. But he has consistently strayed from the message. They can't keep him focused on those issues, and he's making headlines that are distracting from the issues where he could, and in some cases, his allies think he should be winning, Chris.
All right, so Julie, let's look at these overall numbers in these swing states. Among likely voters in Pennsylvania and Michigan, Harris leads by 5. In Wisconsin, she's up by 1. In all those states, only between 1 and 2% say they are undecided. 1 and 2%. That's where we are in 3 battleground states. What makes the difference when you get down to the wire?
This is all about turnout. I don't even know if 1 or 2% really are undecided.
So these issues are baked in, you think now it's about turnout?
Completely baked in, and they've been baked in for months. People know how they feel about Donald Trump. They either love him and they're going to walk over glass to vote for him, or they can't stand him and they're going to walk over glass to vote against him. The bottom line is Kamala Harris needs to ensure that that coalition that she has reassembled, those young voters, those African-American voters, people of color generally, the college-educated women, that they turn out and they get to the polls.
So is it tied together then, if she's making moves in the key areas where he was far ahead, the economy, immigration, if folks are moving toward her, does it make it more likely they'll turn out?
Well, the enthusiasm is with her. There is an enthusiasm gap also. I mean, Trump, again, Americans don't like reruns. I keep saying The Godfather 2 was the only better rerun than the original. Otherwise, people don't want to have a rerun. And Trump is a rerun. They've heard this all before, all the jokes, all the conspiracy theories. We've all been hearing this for nearly a decade now, since he came down that elevator. And so at this point, people want to turn the page. It's not surprising. He's been around a really long time, and he's been sucking the air out of our political system for a very long time. And I think at this point, people want to come out and have a new start, and that's what she represents. Joe Biden didn't, because he was Joe Biden. He'd been around a long time, too. She's a breath of fresh air.
So, Congressman, Harris's most straightforward route to the White House goes through Pennsylvania, and the Times attributed her lead there in part to her strength with white voters, winning by 47 to 46% in the 2 polls, more than the 43% that President Biden had in 2020. How much of a red flag could that be for Donald Trump?
Well, Chris, to me, it's evidence that while both candidates have strong bases, as Dasha said, certainly Vice President Harris has shored up the Democratic base, a base that was deflated with the Biden candidacy. And of course, we know Donald Trump has always had a very strong base. Where Kamala Harris has an advantage over Donald Trump right now is that she has, as traditionally candidates have done in the United States, pivoted to the middle for the general election. She is actually making a play for swing voters, trying to broaden the Democratic Party's tent. She has shifted on issues like energy, fracking. She has proposed a tax policy that is more moderate than President Biden. So that is what I attribute some of her recent successes in polling to the fact that she's actually vying for these swing voters, these undecided voters, while Donald Trump keeps doubling down on his his base. And we've seen for a few election cycles now that his base isn't just enough to get him across the finish line.
Dasha, the Times says its own pollsters were surprised that Harris is doing so well in Pennsylvania because their national poll shows it a dead heat. You've spent an awful lot of time in Pennsylvania. You and I talk whenever you're in-house about the time that you're spending there. So what is it that you think is connecting? What's resonating with those voters?
Well, look, in all likelihood, knowing Pennsylvania, it's going to be close. It's always close. It's likely to be close. But when I was talking to voters before Harris was the Democratic nominee, there was so much frustration, depression, even I'd say, about the repeat of 2020, the Trump versus Biden again. People felt, those moderates felt like Biden, who sold himself as the son of Pennsylvania, as somebody who was going to be there for working class families, like he hadn't done enough. Like he wasn't taking the issues of the economy seriously enough, for example. And just generally, they weren't happy with their choices and they were tuned out. A lot of people were thinking that they just might honestly sit this one out just because they were so frustrated with the state of affairs. That's changed. Harris is acknowledging that the economy is a challenge, that while there are some successes, that prices are simply too high. People need to hear that. Even if there are those indicators that the economy is getting better, when people don't feel the empathy from politicians, seeing that they're still struggling, that prices are still high, even if the rate of inflation is down, they feel that from the government. So there's a sort of sense of empathy from Harris that there perhaps wasn't felt by voters with Biden. And again, it's that freshness, it's that newness. It's not the same old story. There's something to pay attention to now when before they were really pretty happy to just tune it out.
So, Julie, I want to ask you about female voters, because in all three of these states, Harris's lead among women is 20 points or close to it. And then there was an article in Politico about North Carolina, another swing state. It said when you add in comments from the gubernatorial candidate, Mark Robinson, it's almost as if the three leading Republican candidates were built in a lab to offend female voters. It's very funny, but look, the abortion issue started this off, right? But in many ways, with some of the other comments that have been made, in some ways are Donald Trump and his vice presidential pick, J.D. Vance, and the gubernatorial candidate doing her work for her with women?
I mean, you couldn't have constructed a better alternative to what they're saying, right? Here you have a woman, an empowered woman, a successful woman, the second most powerful person in the country, probably in the world, running to be president against people who want to take agency away from women. And I don't care if you're a diehard liberal or you're a suburban mom living in Montgomery County, Pennsylvania, who has voted Republican in the past, you don't want to hear criticism of childless cat ladies, even if you're a mother. You don't want to hear Sarah Huckabee Sanders somehow saying that a woman who's a stepmother is lesser than or doesn't have any kind of responsibility in her life because she was only a stepmother and didn't physically give birth. There are plenty of step-parents out there. There are plenty of people, including men, who are stepfathers who understand they're doing the difficult job of helping to raise children. And when you have J.D. Vance specifically, and Donald Trump, and Mark Robinson in North Carolina,
suggesting that we shouldn't be giving young women contraception.
Contraception. I mean, these are young women who are maybe taking contraception, not just for birth control, but maybe taking it for other healthcare reasons, right? And then yet they're constantly putting down women, trying to drag them back. And again, I don't care what your political persuasion used to be. That really just doesn't sit right with women. And it doesn't sit right with men who care about women and who are also in these positions where they are helping to raise children who may not be there by birth. Listen, I spent part of my life part-time living in Northampton County, Pennsylvania. It is the swingiest county and the swingiest state in the nation. I speak to these women all the time. A lot of them used to vote for Mitt Romney. A lot of them used to vote for George Bush. They've had it. They have had it. And I've never seen this kind of vitriol directed at a Republican by them. Because they're offended to their core about the way that they're being talked about the way their daughters are being talked about. And that's why you're seeing those kinds of numbers move for Donald Trump in Pennsylvania. All he's talking about in Pennsylvania is fracking. They don't care about fracking. They care about making sure that they're respected, and they're not being respected right now by the Republican ticket.
So, Congressman, the AP poll has also pointed out about just general opinions of the two candidates, and it found that among registered voters, Harris's favorability is +8, 52% favorable, 44% unfavorable. Trump, on the other hand, -23, 60% have an unfavorable view of him, -28 with independents. Can you win with those kinds of numbers? What does favorability really speak to?
Well, Chris, the only reason that Donald Trump is in this race is because he has such a solid base of support. But I really think that if we look at these poll numbers today, it shows that that's just not going to be enough, like it wasn't enough in the 18 midterms, in 2020 when he ran for re-election, and in 2022 when Republicans were supposed to have this massive wave. What happens? People don't like Donald Trump's tone. They don't like the way he speaks about things. So he loses those swing voters, and he's left with just his base, which is strong, it's solid, but it's not enough. And I talked earlier about this pivot to the center. That's not just on policy, Chris. The pivot to the center also refers to tone, to the way candidates speak to a general election audience. Very different than primaries, and Kamala Harris has figured that out. She's talking about being inclusive. She has committed to appointing a Republican to her candidate. All of these are overtures to those middle-of-the-road voters. Today, she's winning them. This could all change. We still have a few weeks to go. But right now, the trends are good for Kamala Harris, and it's because Donald Trump has refused, despite the begging of a lot of Republicans, to adopt a strategy that appeals to the center of the country.